From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Roberta Schaefer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Jane Sanchez, the Law Librarian of Congress, who is unable to join us this morning, but sent me her special advisor in her stead. We're really delighted to be hosting this program, which is, I think, becoming part of a series of events in which we are commemorating and continuing to learn from the experience of the Venetian Ghetto. So this 500-year trajectory of learning continues this morning. We had a program last spring. Today is a full day of learning for all of us. We have a phenomenal display of the Library of Congress collections relating to Hebraic publishing during the time of the ghetto, as well as other related documents. This afternoon at 2 o'clock, we will be showing a film. It's a documentary about the Venice Ghetto. And then we will again celebrate the Venice Ghetto with a reappeal, a mock appeal of the Shylock trial from the Merchant of Venice on June 21st in the late afternoon. And the presiding justice will be Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I hope that you will all be marking your iPhones now, and will be able to join us at that time. There is debate, as many of you know, about the term, the derivation of the term ghetto. We do believe that it was first used in Venice, and the area of the Republic that served as the ghetto geographically was previous to that function a smelting area. And so we like to think that if we're looking at positive aspects of the ghetto, that it was a melting pot of many, many ideas and cultures coming together. And such is the reality of today as well, where we have a melting pot of many entities coming together to bring you this program. And so it's really my pleasure to acknowledge the Embassy of Italy, and you'll hear from our esteemed ambassador in a moment, the Friends of the Law Library of Congress, and then the Hebraic section of the African and Middle Eastern Division, the Italian Cultural Institute, and the Primo Levi Center in New York, all of which have a role to play in the programs that the library has been putting on and will continue to put on. We will have two speakers today, Dr. Benjamin Ravid, who's a professor emeritus of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, and Professor Dick Schneider, who is the Associate Dean for International Affairs and a Professor of Law at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem. They will both be discussing different aspects of understanding seclusion, the legal dimensions of the ghetto. And so, without further ado, it is truly an honor to introduce someone who is no stranger to the Library of Congress, our very, very good friend, the ambassador from Italy to Washington, D.C., Armando Varricchio, who I have to say, in addition to being the ambassador, and I think even more appropriately for this morning, is a son of Venice. So without further ado, Your Excellency.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Dr. Schaffer, my dear friend Roberta, for your very kind introduction. It's always a pleasure for me to be back at the library, such a distinguished cultural institution here in Washington. The reason why we're here today is to debate from a legal point of view these days, one of the most seminal events in history, the creation of this place where Jews were secluded. And from the very, very name, the Venetian name of the foundry, the name ghetto became so familiar to us. The reason why we're here also because this event is part of a number of events that we are hosting together with a number of institutions. First and foremost, the Library of Congress, to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the founding of the Jewish Ghetto. And I like very much today's presentation title, Understanding Seclusion, the Legal Dimension of the Ghetto. I want to start all those who have been so important and instrumental to make this event possible. Dr. Natalia Indrimi from the Center of Primo Levi in New York for so generously co-sponsoring today's event. Today that is part of a series, La Serenissima, the most serene Republic of Venice. An event where we're trying to put together different arts, different expression of culture, and today's fits very, very prominently into this. I would also like to welcome our speakers that were already been mentioned, Dr. Professor Benjamin Ravid and Professor Dick Schneider. But today's central theme, seclusion, seems particularly appropriate in this day and age. Particularly today, when we look at the early history of the segregated Jewish community in Venice and showcase rare books and documents from the Library of Congress, collections related to the Jewish ghetto. And it's important to go through those pages because we should never forget that the ghetto, amongst the many other reasons why it has become so important and prominent in history, is because that particular time became a center for culture, production of arts, literature, music. So while these people were really forced into that small, tiny place, their bodies, their persons were secluded, but their souls, their minds, their spirits were flying so high to be able to produce so important piece of arts and culture. But the ghetto, its origin, its history, and what it has become today are so intertwined with the history of Venice, a city which welcomed Greeks, Turks, Armenians, Persians, and probably not as exotic as all those people, but Germans too. Inclusion and seclusion, a city which gave protection to minorities and at the same time kept them separate. This, of course, allows us maybe to spend a few words that I'm sure will be spelled and elaborated later about the importance of the melting pot, which has been mentioned, the way we make sure, even today, that different cultures, different languages, different religions, different identities can coexist. Incidentally, last year marked a particularly memorable first with the performance of the Merchant of Venice in the Old Ghetto, which was either unprecedented. I don't want to retrace here the history that led Leonardo Loredan back in 1516, the Doge of Venice, and the Venetian Senate to issue the decree that all Jews must live together, which in an area which was both enclosed and monitored. What is important today is to stress the fact that the Jewish Ghetto of Venice is considered a pivotal point of reference for Italian Jewish life. It is also the site where many early Hebrew books were first printed, and we can see displayed most important and beautiful examples. And as we stand here today, in what is not only the world's largest library, but one of the embassy's long-standing partner in the city, I must also mention the wonderful Making Hebrew Books in Venice. This is an online exhibit, the result of a multimedia platform created by the Library of Congress of Washington and the Biblioteca Archivio Renato Maestro of Venice. And this will enable younger generation, students, and the general public to access unique pieces. ranging from 1521 to 1862, respectively, the years which the oldest and the most recent Hebrew manuscript kept in Venice date back to, and will be accessible on a permanent basis. But while we go through the pages of those books, while we listen to the importance of ghetto in history, while we assess the legal peculiarity, because Venice was a state of law, so everything was done according to laws of the time, we should also think about our time, our presence, and particularly, these days in Europe, in my Europe, the importance of preserving history and preserving identity. When people struggle for identity, I think that we should never forget that what we are today, what as Italians, as Europeans are today, is because of what we have been in the past, and because of this unique combination of different cultures, of different histories, of different religions. So all of this has made our part of the world unique. And within the broader perspective of the large Europe, there was a tiny, tiny city. I don't know whether you happen actually to land into Venice and look from above, you can see how tiny the collection of islands is. In those little part of Europe, a city that was built not upon a hill but on the water by people who were trying to escape from fear, from anger. The invaders were arriving and they were trying to find escape and a new shelter by taking the water and building on this unhealthy piece of small lands a new city. Venice, as it has been in history, as it is today, would not have been the same without what our brothers, the Jews, have provided to the city, with their ideas, with their daily life, with their businesses, with all their activities that are pertaining to be proud citizens of Venice. So, as I said, for me, it's also an emotional moment to be here today with you today, and I'm sure that, as always, we'll never forget that history is our teacher. And when looking back, and also trying to understand how a democracy of the time, like Venice, according to the laws, took that decisions and made legal the ghetto, we should never forget that laws are so important only if laws can reflect human spirit, values, and not simply make possible what should never be made possible. Thank you very much.
I would like to just remind you before we begin with the formal lecture series to please make sure that your phones are silenced. And now, if you would not mind, if you brought anything in, please place it under the seat in front of you. Fasten your seatbelts and make sure that your minds are in an open and unlocked position so that we may time travel back to Venice, 1516, together with first Professor Benjamin Ravid from Brandeis. Professor Ravid, will you please take the podium? Thank you.
Well, good morning, buongiorno, shalom. To decide what to talk about when it comes to the city of Venice is a major challenge because, there are over 100 islands, one and a half of which, however you want to define it, are the ghetto. There are decades, centuries of history. And I decided that really the two best known things about Venice, one of them is fictional, the other is reality, and I allude here, of course, to Shylock and the ghetto. Since my field is history rather than literature, I thought I should not touch the Merchant of Venice and rather speak about the ghetto. Now, one reason why I especially would like to speak about the ghetto is because of the currency that the word has in everyday parlance. I think every word, every language on the face of the globe I'm not quite sure what goes on in a certain couple of areas of the world. I have absolutely no linguistic control over whatsoever. I can't even recognize the word if I were to see it written out. But I think certainly when it comes to the Western world, the word ghetto has entered everyday parlance. So I'd like to go back after thanking His Excellency the Ambassador for his wonderful opening words, for Roberta Schaefer for having invited me here, for our friends who set up the wonderful exhibition, which I think is very important in showing that there was a Hebrew press, that Venice was indeed the center of the Hebrew press, for Liat for her excellent administrative work in getting me here today. And I'd like really now to turn to something that's really been bothering me for a long time, indeed approaching half a century. And I want to share this concern with you today because it involves not only our understanding of Jewish history and the position of the Jews in the world, but also, as I alluded to before, developments in our time, especially in the field of urban sociology. So I'm going to do this today by considering the nature of the early modern Italian ghetto. Now, my relationship with the ghetto began over 40 years ago as I began my PhD thesis on the topic of the Jewish merchants of Venice. I will not talk about them today. I'll barely mention them. That's another issue. I came across the fact that in 1541, the Jewish merchants were required Jewish merchants coming from the east, Levantine Jewish merchants, complained to the Venetian government that when they came to Venice to trade, they did not have enough room for their merchandise in the ghetto, which was too small for them, and therefore they requested additional adequate place. And the Venetian government, always attuned to the interests and needs of commerce, gave them an additional space in which they were to be confined that was known already then as the Ghetto Vecchio. So since the word ghetto was looming in the very beginning of the story of the merchants, I obviously had to consider also, I wanted to, I don't mean that I had to, it was necessary, to also consider the ghetto. So the history of the Jews of Venice, as we look at their cultural, their intellectual achievements, the community that they built based upon Jewish law, the fact that they had virtually de facto autonomy within the ghetto, etc. For all of the history of the Jews of Venice, the word ghetto is lurking in there and survives down to the present. So if we begin to investigate the institution of the ghetto, the previous literature, and we're back now in the 1970s, there seemed to be a general consensus that the word ghetto first appeared in Venice, but no consensus really about its etymology. Some saw its origin in a Venetian, or at least Italian source, and others derived it more fancifully from Jewish sources. For example, the word ghetto, the word get meaning a bill of divorce because the Jews were segregated from society, etc. And over the centuries, much ink had been spilled on tracing the history of the word ghetto, the background before the Jews came in to be confined to one. Now, actually, the original meaning of the word ghetto was buried in the writings of certain 17th and 18th century Venetian antiquarians and historians, and today it's been established beyond any shadow of doubt that the word originated, as we already heard today, in Venice, in a copper foundry in Venice. So originally then, we have a place called Il Ghetto, the ghetto, that had been the site of the municipal copper foundry of Venice. The main activity there had been the production of bars of copper and also the alloy of bronze used to make cannonballs. Il Ghetto, from the Italian root gettare, to throw or to cast, which we find surviving today in English in words such as eject, jet, trajectory. Now, if you have a foundry, you're going to have waste products, and the waste products have to be dumped somewhere. So across from the ghetto, Il Ghetto was a sort of swampy island. Remember, Venice was all, much of Venice was swampland that was gradually drained, and the piles were put down, and the city built on those, the land claimed from swamp. So basically, the waste products began being dumped on the island across from the ghetto, and what happened was that that island where things were dumped became known as Ghetto Nuovo because it was the new ghetto, the expansion of the ghetto, whereas the old area that had been the foundry area became known as the Ghetto Vecchio. So we have two areas functioning in Venice called ghetto. One is the Ghetto Vecchio, the original one. Those of you who have been there, I presume many of you have been there, right? Fast show of hands, how are we doing? Okay, so remember, the Ghetto Vecchio is on the mainland. Well, not on the mainland. Mainland terra firma means, back in Mestre. It was on a very long island. You can go across on the main street there from one river, one canal, to the main canal of Cannaregio. And the new area on which things were being dumped is the Ghetto Nuovo. Now, as the foundry of the commune, which was producing cannons and walls and the like, as in the 15th century Venice was embarked on expansion on the mainland, terra firma, that means literally the mainland, eventually reaching the borders of Milan in the west, Lombardy, Milan, whatever you want to call it. The ghetto could not produce enough artillery and other things needed for the army, and therefore the manufacture of the bronze, cannons, balls, etc., was moved to the arsenal, and the island, the mainland part, the Ghetto Vecchio on the main larger island, and the adjacent island of the Ghetto Nuovo were sold off, and they became areas which contained modest two-story dwellings. And we'll skip the details that have all been reconstructed on how they were divided up and who owned them and the nature of the housing, etc. Now, as of the earlier days and down to 1516, as the ambassador, I think it was, pointed out, we have no Jews whatsoever associated with the ghetto. It's low and middle income, probably more lower income housing, mainly 2 stories, etc. Now, the interesting thing is, as I began reading on the ghetto and more important Jewish quarters prior to this point of 1516 in the Middle Ages, there was a major problem in that the word ghetto was frequently used to refer to Jewish quarters prior to 1516, which obviously was a major anachronism, since the word was not known outside of Venice, and moreover, nobody would have associated it in any way, shape, form, or manner with the Jews. Now, moreover, this word ghetto was used by our contemporaneous historians to refer to all types of Jewish quarters. Sometimes Jews are living in a segregated area. Sometimes Jews are living mixed among Christians. Sometimes Christians are living in the supposed Jewish area. As an independent variable, sometimes walls were erected, sometimes they had gates, because remember, in those turbulent days, for security, areas would be walled up, gates would be locked at night, etc. The main thing is that almost always, for all of these so-called Jewish quarters, there was no reference to any legislation or edict establishing them. And their origins, as a rule, there are a few exceptions, and if you're aware of one of those few exceptions, just delete it. As a rule, I'll deal with one exception shortly. As a rule, the origins of when the Jews first settled where they were are lost forever in the mists of antiquity. I shouldn't say lost forever because we all know that thanks to wonderful places like the Law Library and the Library of Congress and the preservation of books, one never knows what will be discovered in terms of manuscripts, books, etc. But as of today, things are unclear. So if we go back to Venice, if we read carefully that edict of 1516, we will see, actually, legislation of the Senate of 1516 proclaimed by the Doge establishing the ghetto and the subsequent course of events, we can conclude that the early modern Venetian ghetto was characterized by three important necessary characteristics. First of all, it was compulsory. Every Jew had to live inside the ghetto. No exceptions. Number two, segregated. No Christians were allowed to live inside it. In fact, the Christians had to move out, and the landlords were granted a 1/3 increase to be free from all taxes. Very important. That meant it was worth much more than a third more, in order to get their tenants to move out, and the Jews had to pay more. Thirdly, the area was enclosed. In other words, it was surrounded by walls and a gate or gates that had to be locked at night and remained so locked until the morning. So this then is the main feature, or features if you wish, of a ghetto: compulsory, segregated, enclosed. Now, during the Counter-Reformation period, that usually is taken to date from 1555, we'll say out of the problems of dating things, gradually compulsory, segregated, and enclosed areas of Jewish residence were established in all the other Italian cities, major cities, with the exception of Livorno, such as Rome, Florence, Siena, Padua, Verona, Mantua, and elsewhere. Italian Jews are living behind ghetto walls. Based on the Venetian experience, all of these places were called ghettos, or better in Italian, ghetti. And therefore, I'm proposing that the term compulsory, segregated, enclosed be accepted as the definition of what an early modern ghetto, Jewish ghetto, Italian Jewish ghetto was, to differentiate it from subsequent quarters often referred to as ghettos. Now, with this definition of what constitutes the original ghetto in early modern Europe, it should be noted that there were a few compulsory, segregated, and enclosed Jewish quarters in Europe before 1516, primarily in Castile and Aragon. Let me not talk more about that because it'll take up too much of our time. And most famously, of course, was the ghetto of Germanic lands, Imperial Center, Frankfurt. The ghetto of Frankfurt, established in 1464, would qualify as a ghetto before the word, so to speak. But these quarters were never called ghettos. They were only became called ghettos after the end of the Venetian ghetto, with the coming of the emancipation. That means the end of the 18th century, the end of the 1700s. The word ghetto began to spread. And for example, the segregated, compulsory, enclosed Jewish quarter of Frankfurt was always called the Judengasse, the Jewish street, never called the ghetto until after 1800. The word began traveling northward. So therefore, in the very felicitous formulation of Robert Bonfield, the city of Venice retains the copyright for the semantically innovative term ghetto as defining the locus of the settlement of the Jews in the city. So every Italian city, with the one exception, as we said, Livorno had a ghetto, and I do not mention more about Livorno today because you have one of the world's leading experts on the field sitting in the audience, Bernie Cooperman, who is at the University of Maryland, an old friend from way, way back. Now, one of the new insights on the ghetto, and this is something implied but never quite absolutely realized, is that no matter how many gates and what hour they were locked at, the ghetto was not hermetically sealed, and it was very, very porous. And this has got to be understood as a background for Venice as a melting pot. And not quite a melting pot, as a mixture of various peoples from various backgrounds. The ghetto was established, it is true, to minimize contact between Christians and Jews, but the government only sought to totally eliminate it at night because the Christian authorities feared that under the cover of darkness, all sorts of condemned and forbidden relations could very easily occur, and their suspicion was probably not without grounds. During the day, not only could Jews freely leave the ghetto and Christians could enter at will, but one group of Christians in Venice was even compelled to come into the ghetto. And here, this is most interesting because from the very beginning, or let's say a few months after the very beginning, the Venetian government insisted that the pawn shops, which were the reasons for which Jews were allowed into Venice, and which the government made the Jews operate for the sake of the urban poor, these pawn shops, the reason that the Jews were tolerated in Venice was to be located in the ghetto. So that meant that any Christian engaging in money lending, any Christian engaged in borrowing, had twice to enter the ghetto. Once to pawn his object, and we hope for his sake, a second time to redeem his pawn. Furthermore, and this is often neglected, given the topography of Venice and the size and location of the ghetto, it would be very inconvenient for the Christian inhabitants of Venice to reach their destination on occasion if they could not cut through the ghetto during the day. And I'll digress for a minute to show you how the most unexpected sources dealing with the most unexpected things draw your attention to the commonplace. A proposal was made in I think it was 1764, to establish a bull ring in the campo of the Ghetto Nuovo. Now, I've never personally measured it, and I'm not quite sure if it's absolutely correct, because I can think of a couple of other large campos, but I remember reading somewhere that the campo of the Ghetto Nuovo was the second largest after San Marco in Venice. Whether it is or isn't, the point is it really is large, and it is very convenient for things. Now, there were some objections to this proposal, and one of the objections was that it would handicap the Christians who wanted to pass through the ghetto on the days when it was closed off for the bull ring. The bull ring never went up. There were no races in the Ghetto Nuovo. It's been used for all sorts of things since Emancipation time. Some of them, I've never personally been there on movie night, but I'm sure it's very pleasant under a warm Venetian sky. So anyways, the point is that, that Christians were not strangers to the ghetto. And the converse of this is that during the day, Jews could be outside the ghetto freely. They could associate with Christians or introduce all aspects of Jewish culture denuded of its Christian content, that's worth really a talk in itself, into the ghetto. Italian, or more accurately, Judeo-Venetian, was the spoken language of the Jews. That's basically Venetian dialect with a little Hebrew and Aramaic coming in from the prayer book and the religious sources, etc. Judeo-Venetian was the everyday language. and the elite could not only read Italian, but they also could write it. So Jews are writing in Italian, the vernacular, and even in Latin, because in Latin, in Italy, Latin was not seen as the language of the church, but rather as a language of culture of the inhabitants of the Republic of Letters, and therefore it was not considered by the Jews to be taboo. So we always then have to remember that the term ghetto refers only to the housing arrangements of the Jews, and their culture was determined by their environment, not by their housing arrangements, and the nature of the community was further determined by the nature of the cosmopolitan city of Venice, which, as was so well pointed out by the ambassador, and again, this is another long theme, you can discuss whether the laws regarding the Jews were, quote, fair, humane, etc., or not. By contemporary standards, they were certainly very favorable to the Jews. But the key thing is that everything was passed by a council, by a legislative body. The Jews had every right of appeal, and everything followed the due process of law. The one thing that one can learn from studying Venice is that there were laws. This is a lawful state, and everything is proceeding on a legal basis with committees. Sometimes one feels maybe too many committees, but that's another issue. If you had a problem, you established a committee. They already realized that back then, and how often the committee met, etc., and all that is another problem. The point is, this is a law-abiding state. Now, looking ahead to the 19th and 20th century, because I really want to keep it moving, much confusion arose as both past and contemporaneous dense areas of Jewish residence that were neither compulsory, segregated, nor enclosed came to be referred to as ghettos. It has been observed, in fact, that we're talking now about the end of the 20th century, it's certainly true today, still true, preliminary views of ghetto definitions reveal that the ghetto is probably the most misused and misunderstood spatial concept used by social scientists. Clearly, the extended use of the word ghetto in many different senses created a blurring of the very important distinctions between voluntary Jewish quarters and those that were segregated and enclosed. These distinctions reflected completely different attitudes toward Jews on the part of governments and societies. Because of this blurring, modern scholars have found it necessary to distinguish between different types of ghettos. And I'll skip the details on the terminology, but we have technical ghettos and non-technical ghettos. We have Louis Wirth, the great sociologist of the ghetto of the Chicago School, coining, using the term voluntary ghetto, which certainly would have been considered oxymoronic by inhabitants of the Italian peninsula. And so it goes to distinguish between forced ghettoization, self-ghettoization, etc. Now, in this connection, we ought to note that the 20th century ghettos of Nazi Europe, which is where most people acquire their knowledge of what ghettos were, and as Mitch Denier demonstrated in a recent book, had much to do with popularizing the word ghetto in the Afro-American world, although it was known before that, but it drove it home when soldiers in the American army in Europe saw the Nazi ghettos. These ghettos of modern Europe, if the 20th century is still considered modern, differed fundamentally from those of the early modern Italian peninsula. The Italian ghettos were supposed to provide the Jews with a permanent, clearly defined space in Christian society in accordance with the traditional Christian theology that the Jews were to live in a subjected condition until the second coming of Jesus. This was to prove the rejection of Christianity by God. They're living under abject circumstances until the Messiah came to redeem all of humanity, etc. On the other hand, the Nazi ghettos were very, very different because they in no way had anything permanent about them, that this was no way a permanent settling of the Jewish problem by providing them with a living area because of their economic utility in Christian society, but rather, once the decision to embark upon the final solution had been made, the ghettos constituted a temporary way station on the road to emancipation. And these two different kinds of ghettos reflect the difference between traditional religious anti-Judaism on the one hand and modern racial anti-Semitism in its ultimate form. In the case of anti-Judaism, a Jew could escape the ghetto by conversion. There was a way out. While in the case of modern anti-Semitism, one could not escape by one's own conversion, nor by the conversion of one's parents, nor by the conversion of less than 3 grandparents. So, interestingly, the different natures of the compulsory, segregated, and enclosed ghettos of pre-emancipation Christian Europe on the one hand, and those of, on the other hand, of Nazi-occupied Europe, lead to the conclusion that the experience of European Jewry from 1940 to 1945 did not constitute a return to the Middle Ages, but rather constituted the advent of a completely new and far worse reality. Indeed, the statement, or the misstatement better, that the Holocaust represented a return to the Middle Ages is probably one of the most misunderstood, one of the most widely spread misunderstandings associated with the word ghetto. Now, to begin our descent, to pick up on Roberta's very apt analogy, as a historian, I'm very bothered by the use of the word ghetto to describe a wide range of Jewish quarters, let alone those of subsequent current application to the situation of other minority groups, whatever their nature. And I hope that after a few more minutes, I promise not more than a couple, you too will share this concern. The basic problem is, as one historian put it, the word ghetto has lived through more metamorphoses than any other word with such a long history. So when one hears the word ghetto, one has to ask, to which ghetto is the speaker or author intending to refer, and does the word invoke the desired image? If the compulsory, segregated and enclosed Jewish quarters of Venice, Rome, and Florence were ghettos, if the Lower East Side of New York and Whitechapel and wherever else were ghettos, if Warsaw, Lodz, and Białystok were ghettos, if Westchester and Newton are golden ghettos, what exactly does the word ghetto mean? Incidentally, ghettos did not exist in pre-World War II Eastern Europe. The alleged ghettos of Eastern Europe, which should be called Städtlach or Städtels, and even the entire pre-World War II, pre-World War I Pale of Settlement as a whole, cannot accurately be called a ghetto in the early modern Italian sense, because some Jews were allowed to live inside it, while outside it, while Christians could live within it. I haven't seen it for many years, decades, but I believe that in Fiddler on the Roof, you will not see any ghettos. Now, if our understanding of the word is unclear, how can our understanding of the Jewish experience be? And when we speak of non-Jewish ghettos in the cities of North America, South Africa, and elsewhere, what are we referring to? Is it a compulsory area established by the state, or by zoning laws, or by redlining? If it is compulsory, is it enclosed? Is it gated? Is there a curfew? Is every person who is living in that ghetto required to live in it, and no members of any other community are allowed to live in it? What image comes to our mind when we hear the word ghetto? We may, or we will probably, encounter this important question when we read the morning newspaper or watch the evening news. Now, clearly, the situation cannot be rectified by a global change in every case in which the word ghetto has been used in print in the past. What we can do, however, is use the word ghetto with some explanation, with some nuancing, and with a full awareness of the problematics of identifying a ghetto, and share this awareness with others that the word ghetto has changed its meanings. Now, it's all right if a word changes its meaning, but the problem is when the old meanings are used simultaneously, and you have a pile of meanings, and they're all being jumbled in together, and it's not clear what the user is referring to, it's unclear. And our understanding of the past also becomes very blurred. So I'm suggesting, to conclude, the differentiated use of the word ghetto will lead to a much better understanding of a major feature of both Jewish history, of world history, and I said both, I should say all, of never ad lib. We'll either write that out and stick to it or ad lib completely. That will lead to a much better understanding of a major feature of Jewish history, world history, and urban history. If I may cite the titles of one of my articles, that while every ghetto was a Jewish quarter, not every Jewish quarter was a ghetto. May I put in one personal word for 15 seconds? Today marks for me a first time by which I am greatly honored. I referred to a few of the speakers who preceded me, and I want to thank everybody who came here today. And I have my dear wife with me as usual, but today marks a first in that I have present not only my son, but also my grandson, Ethan, and assuming that he has not left, there he is, he's smiling in the back. So this is the first time I've had the privilege of having Ethan in the audience. And yesterday, when we went around the Capitol building, etc., he asked questions of the guide in almost every place we were. And the questions were so good that I'm going to step down quickly before he gets to ask me a question again today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We're next going to hear from Professor Dick Schneider about The Merchant of Venice. And as many of you know, this late 16th century Shakespearean play is often categorized as a romantic comedy. And it is constantly being alluded to in literature. The Merchant of Venice had been the subject of opera, poems, novels based on it. Recently, a novel by Nadine Gordimer mentions the Venice Ghetto and the Merchant of Venice in one of the chapters. But I think even more fascinating as a tribute to the longevity and continuing influence of this play is first the fact that it was the subject of 3 early silent films, which I am sure are in the collections of the Library of Congress: an English, a French, and a German silent movie. And then in a more contemporary vein, quotes from The Merchant of Venice have been peppered in any number of Star Trek episodes. So if we have any doubt of Shakespeare's enduring legacy or the enduring legacy of The Merchant of Venice, we have contemporary art and culture to point to. So without further ado, I'd like to present Professor Dick Schneider, who teaches law, literature, and culture in addition to his many other duties at Wake Forest University. Professor Schneider.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. Thanks to Roberta and Isabella and the whole staff of the Library of Congress. It's been really a pleasure to work on this project, as well as the project which I'll talk about in just a minute, which is the mock appeal of Shylock coming up in June. I'm going to take now the fictional side of things that Professor Ravid put aside. And the nature of these remarks are going to be completely different from his, because it's the difference between somebody who's looking at something as an aspect of literature and philosophy, as opposed to someone who discusses something as a matter of history. Shakespeare was not writing history. Shakespeare wrote a play. And yet the play itself is based in a profound understanding of history and of the contemporary nature of Venice. Shakespeare, for instance, was very sensitive to the fact that, as Professor Ravid said, Venice was a city of laws, a republic of laws. It stood or fell on the basis of its laws, which is really at the heart of The Merchant of Venice. So, as you know, many Shakespeare plays have seen kind of post-historical kind of rewrites. For instance, in the 18th century, it's well known that King Lear was performed usually with a happy ending. King Lear survived, and Cordelia survived, and they lived happily ever after as father and daughter. Hamlet was rewritten so that Ophelia and Hamlet both end up getting married and live happily ever after. It's interesting to me that the rewrites of The Merchant of Venice seem to be clustered in the last 20 years or 30 years in this country, because lawyers and law schools apparently cannot get over the guilt that they experience at the conviction of Shylock. And so we keep giving Shylock a second chance. And sometimes that second chance works out, and sometimes it doesn't. It depends on the lawyers, and it depends on the judges. These are the so-called mock appeals of Shylock. One difficulty I have is kind of assuming a certain level of knowledge that you have of the play, because what I'm going to be talking about is principally the play. So I'll in just 25 words or less, I hope, just quickly remind you that the play is about a Jewish, you can call him a banker or a usurer, a Jewish money lender who lends money to the merchant, Antonio, and instead of charging him interest, he charges him a pound of flesh. And if Antonio's ships don't come back and the time of the payment of the bond passes, Shylock has the right in his contract and his bond to demand a pound of flesh from Antonio. And so the heart of the play is the working out of this drama. Will Shylock demand this? Will he not? He goes to court with the contract out in front of him, saying that he should be given this right to take the pound of flesh. At the last minute, Portia comes into the action and, in a sense, saves the day for Antonio. She turns the tables completely on Shylock, finds a way to kind of vindicate the laws of Venice, and at the same time declare that if Shylock takes his pound of flesh, that he better take only a pound of flesh and not spill any Christian blood, or he will be found to have violated the alien statute, which requires the Republic of Venice then to take the life of the person who shed the Christian blood. So she completely turns the table on Shylock. And at the end of the play, Shylock has to forfeit all of his wealth, and he has to convert to Christianity. And he ends the end of Act 4. There's still Act 5, but at the end of Act 4, he leaves the play, beaten and humiliated, beaten metaphorically, and humiliated, and kind of crawls away, basically. So that's kind of quickly, in a nutshell, what goes on in the play. I was involved this past summer with, as the ambassador mentioned, there have been a lot of events in Venice relating to the celebration of, or the commemoration of the 500th anniversary of the founding of the Venice Ghetto in 1516. Also, coincidentally, it's the 400th anniversary of the death of Shakespeare. And so the University of Venice principally and the city of Venice last summer mounted an incredibly wonderful experience for everyone who was there at the time, including me and a class of law students from Wake Forest. They did, as the ambassador mentioned, they did a new production of The Merchant of Venice in the Ghetto. It's the first time The Merchant of Venice had been performed in the ghetto, performed outside. It was a remarkable production. There was a book launching. Howard Jacobson has recently written a book, which is kind of a rewrite of The Merchant of Venice, called My Name is Shylock. It's a wonderful book, and I advise you to read that, although I would say before you read the book, you should reread The Merchant of Venice, because the book will not be very understandable. It will be much more understandable if you've recently read the play or seen the play. And it all culminated with this mock appeal that we did, where Justice Ginsburg came all the way to Venice. She appeared, she taught my class. She's a wonderfully generous person that way. I had known her from prior encounters with her, so that was an incredible part of the experience. But then, as I said, it culminated with this mock appeal, where we had 3 lawyers presenting arguments for Shylock, for Antonio, and for Portia. That was the really new part of this particular appeal, was that we added a lawyer for Portia. As I said, this has been done in the past on several occasions. The bar of the city of New York has done it. The University of Chicago has done it. There have been other places where we've had mock appeals of Shylock, but nobody has done it with a 3rd lawyer representing Portia. So that was a lot of fun. We had 5 judges who heard the arguments, and at the appropriate time, we all retired and deliberated about the outcome of the case, which I won't talk about now. That'll be going into too much detail. But this is all going to be reenacted, not with the same personnel, but it will be reenacted in spirit on June 21 here at the Library of Congress. So I encourage all of you to come if you can. Justice Ginsburg will again be the presiding judge. I will again be a judge. We have 3 lawyers to represent the 3 parties. And we have a Shakespeare expert coming down from Columbia while the judges are deliberating. Jim Shapiro will be coming down to talk to the audience as we deliberate about the play. And we hope to have some very fine actors do very short readings of Shylock and Portia's great speeches in the play. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. Now let me get into the kind of the more substance of my remarks. And I'm going to be approaching this issue of understanding seclusion, the title for today's two addresses. As I said, from the standpoint of fiction, it's not a little bit ironic that perhaps the most famous Venetian is a fictional character, somebody who never existed, Shylock. And as I make these comments about Shylock, though, which are all in the way of looking at possible ways under the contemporary kind of legal culture of Venice in the 16th century to defend Shylock, this is also a way to understand seclusion, because defenses of Shylock, really looked at from just a slightly different angle, become ways to understand the seclusion of the Jews in the ghetto. So that's kind of a subtext as I move forward here. So one of the most interesting things that has to be at least talked about before you go into one of these mock appeals is which law do you use, right? Do you provide a kind of new case for Shylock based on the Venetian law that existed at the time? Do you look at the English law that Shakespeare would have been very familiar with as he was writing the play. It's doubtful that Shakespeare ever went to Venice, although The Merchant of Venice kind of provides a center of argument of that, because some people, to the extent that some people think that Shakespeare did not write the plays, it's possible that somebody else went to Venice, but that's a whole other issue. But Shakespeare probably did not go to Venice, and so he's really writing, in a sense, a critique of laws in England and the legal culture in England through the prism of looking at Venice. So he can distance himself from being criticized in England because, hey, I'm just writing a play about Venice. I'm not writing a play about England. So you could look at English laws, or you could look at 20th century or 21st century human rights laws. And that has been a temptation of a number of these mock appeals as they've happened. So for instance, as I mentioned, the bar of the city of New York a couple of years ago did one of these mock appeals, and a guy named Daniel Kornstein, who wrote a book called about Shakespeare and law called Let's Kill All the Lawyers, represented Shylock, and Floyd Abrams represented Antonio. So that was a lot of fun. But just to give you a flavor of some of these more 20th century arguments, Mr. Kornstein, in his arguments, made the following arguments: that the alien statute raised by Portia is unconstitutional and denies equal protection, that Shylock's due process rights were violated when the civil trial evolved into a criminal trial, that the penalties levied against him constitute cruel and unusual punishment, and the order for Shylock to convert violated his right to exercise freedom of religion. So a lot of that, you can see, is borrowed from our Constitution and borrowed from human rights documents and human rights instruments that have developed long after the 16th century in Venice. Floyd Abrams said it would be a mistake to examine the trial court's decision through the unforgivingly politically correct lens of contemporary legal and social mores. So there's this kind of, I guess I would say there's this kind of subtext that you can't look at this decision, this conviction in the play from the time of the 16th century and come up with valid human rights arguments, that you have to move forward and argue anachronistically. So the purpose of my remarks in the next few minutes are to really take this play and look at it from the standpoint of what was the legal culture in Venice and England, which, even though England was a common law country, Venice was a civil law country, those two traditions are quite different. Nonetheless, the intellectual culture and the legal culture was largely shared. They were reading the same people. They were thinking many of the same thoughts, even though they became embodied in different laws. And so I'm just going to suggest some ways to vindicate or to attack the judgment of the court, vindicate Shylock, through looking at contemporary concepts and contemporary understandings of legal culture. So first of all, I'll start off with just some basic human rights considerations. Shylock has not been treated before the court like a human being in the full sense of the concept, nor has he been accorded human rights in his daily life. These arguments have been made, but as I said, not so much in the context of the time. Shylock is, in at least two senses, inhabits a world that is quite different from Antonio and the rest of the Christian aristocracy of Venice. Because he is Jewish, he is first subject to different and more prohibitive laws. He is not a full member of the society in which he lives and works. Second, as a physical constraint of his being socially and legally set off, he must live in the Jewish Ghetto, where he is subject again to harsh restrictions relating to living conditions, travel, and social relations. Yet, notwithstanding his different status, he makes one of the greatest speeches in drama to assert his common humanity with his oppressors. And you all know this speech, and I can't help but just read a little bit of it, just to remind you. This is considered to be, by many commentators, to be Shakespeare's great, plea for human rights, plea for a common humanity. So the fact that Shakespeare makes this, in a sense, in the play is the beginning of proof that there were thoughts at the time that Jews should not have been treated like this. So Salarino asks Shylock what he's going to do if he takes the pound of human flesh. What's it good for? And Shylock responds, to bait fish withal. If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why revenge? The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. So a powerful comment. It's often forgotten that what Shylock is reminding the hypocrite Christians is that he wants revenge. And if he's like them in other things, he's like them in wanting revenge. So Aristotle wrote in the Politics about the impossibility for someone to achieve his or her full humanity when separated from others in the city. The text of Politics was accessible in England and in Venice. Aristotle famously described the human being as a political animal. He wrote that he who is without a city by reason of his own nature and not of some accident is either a poor sort of being or a being higher than man, meaning a god. Clearly, Shylock is not a god. He is like the man of whom Homer wrote in Denunciation, clanless and lawless and hearthless is he. So it's important that Aristotle fixes on this idea of being separated from the city based on his own nature and not of some accident. So here we have Shylock being separated in the ghetto based on his nature of being a Jew. Alistair MacIntyre, interpreting Aristotle's passage, writes that a human being separated from the polis, from the city, is thereby deprived of some of the essential attributes of a human being. MacIntyre aligns Aristotle with Homer and Sophocles as early thinkers who believed that, quote, a human being who is separated from his social group is also deprived of the capacity for justice. He says that, according to Aristotle, quote, separated from the polis, what could have been a human being becomes instead a wild animal. So there's this idea that the nature, that separation in and of itself creates a lack of justice in the separated population, and, according to Aristotle, this idea that there's a fallback to kind of wild, instinctual feelings instead of being governed by legal principles. Shylock, being a political animal yet set off, exhibits the handicaps of separation from other members of the city of Venice. He can be hardly expected to respond justly in contract or in court when he is not a full member of the polis. The explicit and implicit violence of the penalty he includes in the bond is understandable given that he has been deprived of the capacity for justice and may be closer to a wild animal. For an extreme example of this outcome of exclusion, you can take a look at Barabbas in Marlowe's Jew of Malta. Right? So it's possible that Shakespeare, there were several things involving Jews that were happening in England about the time Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice, but one of them was that Marlowe had a great deal of success writing the Jew of Malta, and Barabbas is a very different character than Shylock. If the court in Venice were forced to recognize the legal and physical separation suffered by Shylock and its effects, it might begin a process of inquiring into the justification for its laws when applied to contracts between Jews and Christians. In any case, this might be an approach to a kind of nascent idea of a human right to equality of treatment. So I'm putting together Shakespeare's own speech, which I just read to you, and Aristotle. All right, on a slightly different topic, Aristotle himself opens the door to the judge acting justly. What is the responsibility of the Duke of Venice to answer justly, to act justly, and not perhaps just according to the laws? Another very influential Aristotelian text in the Renaissance was the Nicomachean Ethics. In it, Aristotle writes that, quote, when people dispute with one another, they find refuge before a judge. To go to a judge is to go to the just, for a judge wishes to be, as it were, the just ensouled, close quote. An effective counter-argument to using Aristotle to argue for equality of treatment might be that Aristotle also accepted slavery. As you know, there was slavery in the Greek city-states. And it's interesting that that Shylock also points out the hypocrisy to the Christians in The Merchant of Venice of the fact that they have slaves, that they own property. And so therefore, he's saying, why can I not at the same time enforce my contract for the pound of flesh? Okay, Michel de Montaigne, the great French philosopher of the 16th century, can also be brought to bear to demonstrate that there was a whiff of tolerance in the air at the time that Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice. Montaigne was available to the educated, and Shakespeare had access to Montaigne's essays as of 1580 when they were first published. He could have read them in whatever French he had available to him. Of course, the essays became fully available to Shakespeare when they were published in English translation in 1603, but that was after the composition of The Merchant of Venice. The relations between The Merchant of Venice itself and Montaigne are beside the point here. The point is whether at the time it would have been possible in Christian Venice to see a way toward more tolerance with respect to laws. In fact, Montaigne was at the very beginning of the arc of toleration that would eventually culminate with the Bill of Rights in America and the Declaration of the Rights of Man in France. His famous essay, Of the Cannibals, specifically purposes to impress Europeans with conflicting but legitimate claims to knowledge and practice exhibited by non-European peoples. In the case of the essay, it was Brazilians. In John Florio's translation, Montaigne writes, now to return to my purpose, I find, as far as I have been informed, there is nothing in that nation, Brazil, that is either barbarous or savage, unless men call that barbarism, which is simply not common to them. As indeed we have no other aim of truth and reason than the example and idea of the opinions and customs of the country we live in, where is ever perfect religion, perfect policy, perfect and complete use of all things. So Montaigne is saying that we have to look at other groups through an understanding that just because they do something differently from the way we do it doesn't mean that we have the right to judge them or think that what they're doing is in some way inferior to what we do. Could the judges in the case of Shylock's arguments not exhibit some of the toleration and humanism Montaigne evidences toward peoples far from Europe. Could toleration become especially relevant when Shylock's ultimate punishment, forced conversion, is considered? Okay, so those are kind of some broad human rights and toleration ideas. To go to the ghetto more explicitly, Shakespeare never mentions the Jewish ghetto in The Merchant of Venice. This is one of the things that has puzzled people who've thought a lot about The Merchant of Venice. If Shakespeare knew Venice so well, why did he never mention the ghetto? There's no answer for that. The question has entered into, well, I already mentioned that, it's entered into a small controversy over who wrote The Merchant of Venice. So the arguments noted above under human rights take for granted that Shylock is being treated differently and unfairly, but do not describe in detail the kinds of prohibitions under which he would have lived and worked. So as Professor Ravid mentioned, the ghetto was located in the northwest part of the city on two small islands. The islands were linked to the city by two small bridges, always under guard by Christian soldiers who were paid not by the city, but by the inhabitants of the ghetto. Residents of the ghetto could not leave between sundown and sunrise because the city closed the bridges. Moreover, the other parts of the ghetto were separated from the water by high walls. Finally, the Jews had to pay the costs of 2 boats that kept the ghetto surrounded and under guard. If the Jews left the ghetto during the day, they had to wear identifying marks, yellow badges, or skull caps during their stay in the city. In addition to the requirement to live in the ghetto and abide by its exclusions, Shylock and all other Jews in Venice faced frequent and significant taxation, as well as a large number of government economic regulations. They could not engage in numerous trades. They were prohibited from engaging in numerous trades and limited to particular trades like pawn shops, secondhand clothes, and money lending. The Catholic Church proscribed some of this activity, so the Venetian economy needed the participation of the Jews. That was the deal. The Jews could live in Venice in the ghetto if they provided those services. So it should be obvious at this point that there is at least one strong reason for Shylock to insist throughout most of the trial scene on repayment of his bond. This is an individual who has very limited rights, and the according of those rights to him are all beyond his control. The city determines what Shylock may do and what he's prohibited from doing. From physical movement to business occupation to the conduct of commerce, Shylock is constrained. Here in The Merchant of Venice, he at last possesses a piece of paper, a contract, a bond, that seems to give him some rights. Can he be blamed for reading it with blinders, ignoring the larger context of discrimination that Portia brings so dramatically to bear when she argues her case under the Alien Act? Should the court be so quick to condemn the expressive nature of Shylock's small page of freedom? So, I'm arguing that Shylock has a desire to express his own yearning for freedom through the insistence on the bond. And now the symbolism behind the penalty. Shylock argues that his motive in signing the bond with Antonio was not to seek the life of any citizen, even though the bond called for the pound of flesh. Motive must be important, so this is under the Alien Act. Motive must be important because otherwise it's possible that an alien doctor, including a Jew, who helped a Venetian citizen could come under the law. Likewise, an alien who accidentally causes a Venetian to fall and cut himself could be prosecuted under the law. So motive is important. But there's a better, more compelling argument that I don't think has been raised anywhere else in the literature on The Merchant of Venice. I would argue that the motive behind the particular penalty demanded by Shylock, the pound of flesh, is in fact a proxy or a symbol of life in the ghetto, and more incisively of the ghetto itself. The ghetto is cut out of the body of the city of Venice and exists within it, but separately. The pound of flesh, once removed, interrupts the smooth functioning of the human body, just as the distinct physical separation of the ghetto interrupts the continuity and the flow of Venice. So Dr. Ravid was talking about the need for Christians to be able to cross the ghetto, to come and go. The ghetto interrupts that natural flow. Shylock is showing Antonio and the rulers of Venice through his ruse of the pound of flesh just what the ghetto's separate status is doing to Venice and to the Jews who are forced to live there in relative isolation. This possibility is supported by two historical references. First, in 1516, the decree that created the ghetto, when the Venice City Council ordered the Jews to leave other parts of Venice and move into the ghetto, it declared that the Jews had to be removed e corpore civitatis, which means they had to be removed from the body of the city. So Shakespeare had a ready metaphor in the legal document itself that created the ghetto. Second, a contemporary of Shakespeare who traveled in Italy, including Venice, and published a kind of travelogue in 1611 about those adventures and many others, spoke of the Jews who could, quote, flay many a poor Christian's estate by their griping extortion, close quote. Of course, Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice earlier than 1611, but this line opens the possibility that people at the time thought of the extraction of wealth from another person as a kind of skinning or flaying. The relation to the pound of flesh is obvious. Related expressions today might include skinflint or the skin off my back. Okay. And just a couple more quick comments about defenses that could be made for Shylock. There's the idea of the other, of course. This is an idea which is pursued mostly in the 20th century through a philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas. And I'm not applying this 20th century idea to The Merchant of Venice, but what I am saying is that if you look at Shylock through the lens of being the other, that a great deal becomes clear in the play. So I think in that sense it's appropriate, even though the philosophy itself might not have been in existence at that point. Shylock is fighting back against marginalization, against this othering. He fights back through his negotiation of the bond with Antonio and through his conduct during the trial. But he cannot overcome his fundamental invisibility to the Christian forces aligned against him. First, the negotiation of the bond. Shylock means the bond to be an affirmation of his own being. As noted above, it has an expressive side, wholly apart from its legal nature. Shylock wants to be noticed and wants his message to be understood. At the same time, however, the bond and its penalty may be a significant weakness for Shylock. I earlier alluded to Shylock's famous Act 3 speech, what I read, where he seeks common ground with Christians, and in particular with respect to revenge. Revenge is often overlooked and underplayed in discussions of the speech when a commentator is emphasizing Shakespeare's empathy and compassion for Jews. As Shylock says, if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? What I want to focus on is Shakespeare's use of the word wrong. What is Shylock speaking about? A legal wrong or a moral wrong, or just a semantic wrong? If a legal wrong, then we do not question Shylock's recourse to the legal system. But if he's speaking about a moral wrong, and the speech as a whole is overwhelmingly about moral wrong, then Shylock's own moral failing is that he's using the legal system to obtain revenge. Bassanio, in the very next scene, calls attention to the problem when he says, quote, in law, what plea so tainted and corrupt, but being seasoned with a gracious voice, obscures the show of evil. So Bassanio knows that law can dress something up that is corrupt, can make it seem to be acceptable. Finally, during the trial scene in Act 4, Shylock shows his profound blindness to his own failing when he says, what judgment shall I dread, doing no wrong? He cannot see the wrong that he does to the legal system by making it an accomplice for revenge, notwithstanding his desire to make his bond an instrument of dissent. So in the process of his trying to overcome his othering, he makes other mistakes certainly category mistakes. Okay, and then two more points. Next, Shylock's conduct at the trial. Fundamentally, even though Shylock abides by the rules of the court, he does not submit himself fully to the forms of argument expected by his adversaries or by the Duke. So at least within the construct of the play, as shown by Quentin Skinner in his book Forensic Shakespeare, this is a really wonderful book about taking apart several of Shakespeare's plays and looking at them from the standpoint of rhetoric and forensics that were available in the Renaissance. The Duke and Portia expected a very particular form of argumentation from Shylock. They did not get it. The expected argument would have tracked the rhetorical prescriptions of classical authors such as Cicero and Quintilian. Skinner argues that Shylock, by straying from the prescriptions of classical rhetoric, hurt his own case. If Shylock does not adopt the expected rhetorical strategies, is he instead using argument in ways intended to call attention to his status as other? Specifically, how much was Shylock's rhetoric a product of his own Jewish philosophy and forms of Talmudic argumentation? Was the ruling against Shylock delivered in part out of a failure to grasp the difference between Western forms of argument and Jewish forms of argument? Without attempting anything more than suggestion at this point, I would direct your attention to a work such as David A. Frank's article, Arguing with God, Talmudic Discourse and the Jewish Countermodel. Frank argues that the Jewish form of argument is founded on freedom rather than necessity. He opposes the Jewish act of argumentation to classical forms of debate that depend rather on apodeictic reasoning, or reasoning that goes to a clear certainty, a standard that forecloses discussion. Frank quotes two writers on rhetoric and says, recourse to argumentation assumes the establishment of a community of minds, which while it lasts, excludes the use of violence. But Shylock is read, so my argument reverses the traditional reading of the trial scene where Shylock is read as advocating violence, the penalty, and Portia mercy. However, the violence of the decision and sentence happen because they're moving toward a conclusion in Western style. That is, inevitably with closure, when Shylock must surrender his wealth and convert to Christianity. No one will ever be able to show whether Shylock would have shown mercy to Antonio had he won his case. Perhaps the point would have been made and the discussion could continue with mercy in the offing. In other words, that Shylock was arguing from a point of open-endedness rather than closure. Okay, I'm going to skip over some of this, and I just want to get to one final thing, which is from Boccaccio. So this is an argument focused on the systemic failure of the Venetian state to take into account the Jews and their perspective. Shylock and the Jews had no role in debating or adopting the laws enforced by the court. Is it equitable to have those laws applied cruelly and exactingly to those excluded from the polis? In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle wrote that what is called judgment, in reference to which we assert that people are sympathetic judges and have judgment, is the correct decision as to what is equitable. Madonna Philippa in Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the 14th century, articulated very clearly the principle that it is not equitable to hold one group, in her case women, accountable to laws that have been adopted without their participation or contribution. In the case at issue, Madonna Philippa is accused of adultery, but she argues that, quote, every man and woman should be equal before the law, and laws must have the consent of those who are affected by them. These conditions are not fulfilled in the present instant because this law only applies to us poor women, who are much better able than men to bestow our favors liberally. Moreover, when this law was made, no woman gave her consent to it, nor was any woman ever even so much as consulted. It can therefore justly be described as a very bad law. So there was a very strong historical argument at hand for Shylock. Boccaccio was well before Shakespeare wrote, and Shakespeare knew Boccaccio, knew his writing. one has only to replace women in Madonna Filippa's speech with Jews. And by the way, Madonna Filippa was acquitted of all the charges brought against her. So I urge you all to come to the mock appeal in June and see how this works out yet again. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We are going to have a brief question and answer period, but I would be entirely remiss if I didn't acknowledge the third intellectual giant who is not physically on the podium with us this morning, but who is nonetheless pervasive throughout the program, and that is Nathan Dorn, the curator of rare books at the Law Library of Congress. Nathan organized the panel, he organized the display with our wonderful colleague Ann Brenner, and he also is the person who created the wonderful postcard book that all of you should have received as a favor today. And so before I bring Professor Ravid and Professor Schneider back to the podium to answer your questions, I would please ask you to join me in giving Nathan a resounding applause. And now, members of the library staff have microphones. I must remind you that our program is being videotaped, and that if you do ask a question, you will likely be captured on the videotape. And if that's an issue for you, then our speakers will be here after the program for you to ask them a question privately. So if Professors Ravid and Schneider will rejoin us here, we'll take questions from the audience, and then I know many of you have to leave, so I remind you that at 2 o'clock we'll be showing the movie, the documentary about the Venetian Ghetto right here in this room. And there's a wonderful cafeteria just behind us if you need to refresh yourself in between. So please join me.
I'd like to know whether ghettos were prone, since they were solidified Jews, whether they were prone to attack rather than protected. Were they closed off at night in order to avoid carnal relations? I believe the popes specifically objected to carnal relations between Jews and non-Jews. The very fact that the Merchant of Venice has that title is because Jews, wasn't it because Jews were forbidden to participate in any guilds or to own land in most of that time period? And finally, weren't ghettos, such as the one I saw in Paris, not allowed to expand outward, but only upward, so that there was very closed and crowded conditions? Thank you.
I think, Professor Ravid, that is more your question.
Well, I'm sorry, my short-term memory is going, but let me try to remember some of the points that you asked. Number one, there are many kinds of merchants. You have merchants who are engaged in local trade. You have merchants who own stores. You have merchants who engage in long-distance trade. You have merchants who engage in maritime trade. And in one lecture, I speak about the Jewish merchants of Venice, because Venice specifically welcomed Jews who could engage in long-distance maritime trade. And as I've shown, one of the greatest departures in Venetian law was allowing former Moranos who had been baptized, that is, Jews who had been baptized as Christians, to revert to Judaism in violation of canon law, and to instantly be allowed to engage in the Levant trade, for which Christians normally had to wait 25 years before they could do it, because of the economic necessity for Jews to help out international Jewish merchants, Sephardim, many of them, to help Venice with its declining commerce for various reasons. So I think we have to differentiate between various kinds of merchants. And I would say that at the time Shakespeare wrote his book, the Jewish merchants in Venice had just been given that unique charter, allowing them to allowing converted Jews to revert to Judaism openly in the ghetto, for which they would have been burnt in Rome, and they would have been allowed to immediately engage in trade with the Levant rather than waiting for 25 years. So when we talk about Jewish merchants, we have to ask what kind of Jewish merchants. And ironically, money lending at the time Shakespeare wrote his Merchant of Venice was no longer there was no longer at all the provenance of individual Jews, but rather the Jewish community ran loan banks that operated lending money under government control at the low rate of 5%, which was economically unviable. So if anybody was a merchant of Venice, at the time Shakespeare wrote the play, you could make the case that it was equally the Jews. Money lending is something else that is so stereotyped. Erroneously, Italian Jewish money lending was really small-scale pawnbroking for the sake of the urban poor. I'm sorry, could you give me a couple of the other questions again?
She asked about the violence. Was there violence?
Punished for leaving?
Sure.
Were they punished for leaving? Were they punished for leaving at night?
Oh, yes,
And
absolutely, yes.
Would you address the Pope's refusal
Well,
for
I'll
carnal
tell you.
between Jews and non-Jews?
Well, I'll tell you, I'd rather stay out of the popes today, but I'll be happy to talk to you about that later since we're sticking to Venice.
And you still are talking about different kinds of trades and not the fact that Jews were not allowed to participate in owning land or joining guilds.
Jews were forbidden by law to own any land anywhere in the Venetian state as of 1443. Jews, it was not necessary to have a law forbidding Jews from joining guilds because the guilds were so Christian in nature, with Christian services, Christian initiations and chapels and what have you, that you did not need a law that no Jews may. De facto, the Jews did not join the guilds, and Jews had their own separate guilds. There was one thing that the Jews were allowed to do, and that was the sale of second-hand goods, which were very important back then in the pre-industrial age because everything had to be made by hand. So furnishing and rugs and clothing, etc., was custom-made for the individual who ordered it. Jews had a major role in that trade. Jews had their own guild of second-hand dealers. Now, the Pope set the rules. The Pope did not legislate for anywhere outside of Rome. Each country, and we call Venice, Florence, Milan countries, each one of them had their own government. And in Venice, the church did not legislate. The government legislated. But the government happened to be a Catholic government. So the government did accept much of the general Christian legislation on the Jews. Technically speaking, the Jews in Venice came eventually to wear red hats, and the Levantine Jews only apparently were, no, I'm sorry, the native Jews of Venice were wearing red hats, yes, and the Levantine Jews were wearing yellow. So we have two colors going systematically. So if we're talking about Venice and the government of Venice, let's forget about the Pope unless we're talking about a comparison between the traditional demands of Christianity and their implementation by the secular rulers in every country, because they enacted the laws. Okay, I'm sorry.
Let's see if Professor Schneider has anything to say and maybe move on, because we're a little constrained by time.
Yeah, I would just say that at the heart of the Merchant of Venice is the romance between Jessica and Lorenzo. So there's the Christian and Shylock's daughter Jessica, and so Shakespeare certainly gets us into that issue of carnal relations between Christians and Jews.
We have some other questions. We'll take these two.
Hi, I'd like to, if you could talk a little bit more about the context in which, at the time, the ghetto was established. Was anything going on in particular in the early century that would cause the city of Venice to establish the ghetto?
Basically, Jewish moneylenders had been expelled from Venice in 1397. They could only return for 15 days at a time, but there was a war on the Venetian mainland known as the War of the League of Cambrai, in which much of Europe was organized against Venice. There were Jews on the Venetian mainland, Padua, Mestre, etc., who were moneylenders. They fled into the city of Venice across the lagoon, into Venice itself. They were supposed to go back home. They argued, we can't, our houses are destroyed. They were in Venice. They suggested to the Venetian government, let us stay because we can lend money and we can give you loans. And the government said, okay. And that's what led the Jews in 1513 to be allowed to stay in Venice on the basis of a charter. However, the government realized it was not appropriate for Jews to be living all over the city. 1515, an attempt to confine them to a segregated area did not pass. 1516, it did. So I would say that the ghetto, in one sentence, that the ghetto was a compromise between having the Jews living freely all over the city or expelling them once more as they had in 1397. And it decided that because of the economic utility of the Jews, it would allow them to stay. But it had to be segregated. That was the deal till the end of the Republic.
I think we have one more. Okay, two more questions. One right here, and then one in the back, and then we'll invite you to return at 2 o'clock.
Hello, Professor Schneider. I sense we're avoiding this, but I'm going to ask it to you anyway. In the 30s, a famous Jewish scientist named Sigmund Freud wrote a paper, classic paper, that there was no Shakespeare. It was the Earl of Oxford, because Shakespeare never left England. And so a lot of people wrote papers on this. And you were sort of talking about that as a controversial issue. Do you know anything about the anti-Semitism of people in that period, the Earl of Oxford and others, that caused the creation of that play? And the point also that if you're a playwright, you can say things and get away with it. And so he didn't probably want his name up there. So he made up a name Shakespeare.
Well, I mean, I would say if there's a Q&A in June, you should ask Jim Shapiro that question. He will first of all be angry, but then he'll answer the question. No, I don't want to get into the authorship issue because that's just such a huge issue. But I would say that, apart from the Jew of Malta being very popular, and people do question whether Shakespeare could have written the plays because of he didn't go to this place, he didn't go to that place, he didn't read this language, he didn't read that language. But I'm personally convinced that Shakespeare was one of those kinds of absorptive geniuses who didn't have to do a lot of things that other people have to do in order to capture a place or a people or something like that, that he was just, that was the part of the nature of his genius. The other thing that was going on with respect to the Jewish relationships at the time was there was a very famous trial involving the personal physician of Queen Elizabeth, who was Jewish. And there was an allegation that he was involved in a spy plot against the crown. And so, and it basically became a show trial, and he was beheaded. And so this brought attention to the Jewish plight, because the Jews were kicked out of England in the 13th century, and so they were not allowed. There were very few Jews that Shakespeare would have really come in contact with, if any. So there were things going on at the time that maybe brought this up, but the subject allowed him. The thing that obviously is ironic and very ironic for us, but not for them at the time, is that the Merchant of Venice is a comedy. It's not a tragedy. We tend to think of it as a tragedy because of the way Shylock is treated, but it was a comedy because it ended happily. He converted to Christianity, what better result could there be? And so, you know, it's a difficult thing for us to put ourselves back into that time, but I would just.
We'll take our final question in the back. Please wait for the microphone.
Thank you. I have a question for both of you. Professor Ravid, prior to 15th century, you mentioned that the Ghetto Vecchio, which was producing bronze and other things for armories, was moving to the mainland. At that time, were the Jews involved in the production of, these armories and bronze? And if that is the case, did they move also to Lombardia, to other places, along with this? And if that is the case, was the law, the Venetian law of excluding the Jews into the camp, came after that period? That is something which you may reflect on, or my understanding may be wrong. Professor Schneider, I have, when I studied Shakespeare, Sherlock Holmes, the idea was from the social point of view, how much greed was there with the money lenders. The way we understood that play was, there was a very big greed, and that was how it was being portrayed. And even at a later stage, anti-Semitism was building on such anti-Jewish greed that came. Now, your excellent presentation, in fact, looking from the other point of view, the revenge point of view, within the context of the Venetian law. And then now that there is a revised play, is this revising or giving us a different perspective of revenge? And the play that you mentioned in June, would that make us understand the other side of the story? Thank you.
Why don't you go first?
Yeah, I didn't go into the question or the controversy or the discussion of whether Merchant of Venice is a specifically anti-Semitic play. That's something that a lot of people, using the speech that I read, people point to that and say, well, no, Shakespeare's writing a play that, in a sense, ennobled the Jew and ennobled Shylock, so that we can see, and feel more sympathy when he's convicted and forced to convert. Other people argue, no, that he's adopting stereotypes and using the Jew just for dramatic effect, and that it's, in fact, an entirely anti-Semitic play because of the fact that it is, it ends happily from the standpoint of the Christians. They successfully silence Shylock. They managed to clear the decks of his legal claim and save Antonio in a way that doesn't seem to shed any real negative consequence on the Christian community. So there's a real debate about whether the play is anti-Semitic or not. I think that from the standpoint, another part of the answer to the question is that this play has really been, the production history of this play is fascinating. And after World War II, many places will not produce the play because of the fact that it has such resonance now, given what happened with the Holocaust and the fate of Jews in Europe and in other parts of the world. So it's something that it has actually made the play more sensitive to people, which is part of the reason that I think that the trial, the appeal that we have in June will be very interesting, whether it will answer these questions. One of the ways that you can answer the legal side of it is to look back at the Venetian laws and say, would it have been acceptable or legal for somebody to demand a pound of flesh instead of an interest rate? And for that, you really need a lot of expertise in contemporary Venetian and civil, Roman civil law. So I don't think we're going to go, down that route, particularly on the actual interest and the usury and that kind of thing. But I do believe that the appeal will shed a lot of light, and I think Jim Shapiro's talk will also address some of these issues. So I don't know if that's an answer, but okay.
Yeah. I would give a very, very resounding yes echo to what you said, that the issue is not so much Shakespeare, but rather what later generations saw in it. Very, very briefly, it's been argued that an anti-Semite, a real anti-Semite, or we should use the word anti-Judaism, because, and the word anti-Semitism shouldn't be used before the concept of Semitism came up and all that and so on. And the problem in Shakespeare's day was the problem with the Jew religion, and the religion you could save yourself by conversion, and Shylock's conversion was seen as said as a victory for Catholicism, and also it was seen as being good for Shylock, because by converting he would be saved on the day of judgment. So converting to Christianity was something that Christians also saw as benefiting the immortal soul of the Jew, who would not go to purgatory as a result. The reaction of the Jew is another thing. I think the problem is that the image of Shylock became the image of the Jewish usurer, and the key thing is the portrayal of Shylock on the stage. You know, does he have a big hook nose and hunched over, and the way he pronounces things in the Eastern European Yiddish type accent, which was relatively almost unknown in Venice? How do you portray him? How is the play directed indicates whether it's anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic or not. Had Shakespeare been really anti-Jewish, we would have had more Jewish figures in his plays, and they all would have been nasty, bad Jews, because the real anti-Semite usually will point to negative aspects of the Jews everywhere. So that's one. Number two, regarding Jews, money lending, etc. The word money lending, the word bankers, forget it, except for maybe the Rothschilds. Money lending is not always accurate, because Jews very often were limited to pawnbroking, and in the case of Italy, under low rates of interest. This might cause anti-Judaism for the very simple reason that just as we do not like our credit cards in our banks when they say you missed a payment or you didn't pay everything, therefore you'll pay 18% a year, and therefore we say expletive deleted you, because we do not like our bank. It charges us penalties, it charges interest rates, etc. So it is a pleasure to be able to borrow money. That helps you. Returning money does not help you. So even if the Jews were only charging decent rates of interest, that leads to sentiment against the Jews. That combines with Christian anti-Judaism, because their religion is off, combines with the dislike of the perceived oppressor who is charging high interest rates, etc., allegedly high rates, but you have to return anything. If you're borrowing, you need money. So returning more than you borrow, returning what you borrowed is hard enough. Having to return interest on top of it is even worse. That plus racial anti-Semitism is another component, so that strengthens the argument that the question is, how is the play directed and what is the view of it? So I would come down on the side, the play is not anti-Jewish. There is that wonderful quote that you gave, the context of the times. Well, anyways, okay, thank you very much.
So rather than ending on expletive, let's end extraordinarily and give a very, very large round of applause to Dick Schneider, Benjamin Ravid, and Nathan Dorn, and the Law Library staff.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.